Hey,
It's Ophi. Ophi YouTube videos.
don't adjust your whatever device you're hearing this on. It's me. Live and in stereo. No return engagements. No encore, and this time absolutely no requests. Get a snack. Settle in. Because I'm about to tell you the story of my life. More specifically, why my life ended.
I don't know why I was just going to explain myself, like, oh, I've been suicidal. It doesn't matter that I have or whether or not I have, because I clearly have about as much authority as anybody who wrote these scripts based on the skill present in any of the scripts that were written for this show.
This came out and I started hearing from teens and hearing how deeply it's been affecting them, and it kind of did a number on me.
This book moved me like no other book I have read. It made me think about my life and how it really isn't that bad.
This book is amazing. It changed my view of bullying. It's real.
When I first started writing the book, I talked about it's about a girl who sends these tapes. And when I would say the word suicide, and immediately everybody thought they knew exactly what the book was about. So I started rephrasing it to about this boy that gets these tapes, and on it's the girl who committed suicide 2 weeks earlier.
Hey, it's Hannah. Hannah Baker.
And if he received these tapes, he's one of the people mentioned on the tapes as one of her reasons why.
And if you're listening to this tape, you're one of the reasons why.
So once I get into more of this suspense and eeriness quality, then people are more interested.
If you are somebody who finds even discussion or mention of the subject matter contained within 13 Reasons Why to be triggering and detrimental to you, this is unfortunately not a video that I can recommend you continue to watch. If you aren't already familiar with the content that is discussed in 13 Reasons Why, you can find a detailed list of content warnings in the description below. I will have timestamps for when I'm talking about each specific thing, but you can also find my document where I go into a bit more detail about each of those things and my sources for some of the videos that I've watched and pulled from as I've compiled this video. The show has a pretty good visual shorthand for when a scene that you're watching took place in the past or in the present. It just doesn't trust its audience to rub two brain cells together and see that, so as a result, we end up way overcorrecting. And Clay, played by Dylan Minnette, happens to get the shit beat out of him right at the start of every season so that there can be a band-aid on his face. Because Netflix doesn't trust that the audience can tell based on the lighting shifts and general context and content of the scenes when it's the past and when it's the present. You just gotta look for the band-aid. As I said, I feel like I'm about as qualified as those showrunners were, and I'm gonna take their idea. This video was going to be a numbered list. I would love to share with you 13 thoughts that I still have about what I think might be the most manipulative teenage adaptation in the history of Netflix dramas. Reason 1. The weird PSA content warning thing that got stapled onto the beginning of episode 1 at some point after the initial release of the first season.
Hi, I'm Dylan Minnette, and I play Clay Jensen.
I'm Catherine Langford, and I play Hannah Baker.
I do want to point one thing out here with Hannah. That accent is the first sort of puncturing in the fiction of what we're about to see. And it comes before we see the actual show, but likely after we've seen the trailer. Compare the way she just said
Hannah Baker.
the way she says it in the trailer.
Hey, it's Hannah. Hannah Baker.
That on its own, if that were the only real puncturing of the fiction, I probably wouldn't have even said it that way. But it's really stark when it's paired with what comes after it. Because the second puncturing of the fiction is one that's used after we've brought in Bryce.
I'm Justin Prentice. I play Bryce Walker.
And Justin Prentice, the actor who plays Bryce, and his impossible job as both the primary antagonist as the series and one of the main people promoting it. That's another one of my thoughts. We're going to get to it, but I do want to get through this PSA first. He's the second person to rip through that suspension of disbelief. He reminds us that this is a show that we are about to watch.
13 Reasons Why is a fictional series that tackles tough, real-world issues, taking a look at sexual assault, substance abuse, suicide, and more.
And the other character who sort of warns us away in this section is a character who is revealed before almost anybody else to have been the subject of one of Hannah's tapes. In other words, to be one of the reasons why Hannah Baker took her life.
But if you are struggling with these issues yourself, this series may not be right for you, or you may want to watch it with a trusted adult.
Apparently, Bryce ends up with a redemption arc later on in the show, which I never plan on watching far enough to get to. And I'm sure Jess gets a redemption arc as well because she's deserved one the entire time. But it still feels interesting to me. Like, I know I'm likely reading too far into it, but the antagonist and the antagonist light being the ones sort of attempting to persuade us not to watch the show, if I put on my most oppositional, defiant teenager brain, I don't know. What do you think?
Or you may want to watch it with a trusted adult.
I'm thinking that sounds a little bit like a dare. I'm thinking it sounds a little bit like I should prove to myself that, of course, I care about mental illness and mental health, and I'm personally affected by it, so I shouldn't be triggered by watching it. I should be able to. I'm not pulling that out of nowhere, unfortunately, when it comes to the fan culture response to 13 Reasons Why.
Watching this show tests my strength as a survivor.
And we're going to get to that in just a second. But before we wrap up with this particular PSA, look at what Hannah and Clay, somebody who hasn't yet seen the show, who is experiencing this first exposure, already knows enough about the show, likely either due to reading the book or seeing the trailer or the general hype around the show. They can tell Hannah and Clay are the good ones. And of course, Hannah and Clay aren't the ones saying, don't watch this. The show hinges on you feeling like listening to Hannah, hearing her last words, listening to these tapes is you fulfilling a want that she has. They play at that in the trailers even.
I can't tell you that. You have to listen.
Hannah is never going to tell you not to watch this show. I don't know. Keep your eye on that.
By shedding a light on these difficult topics, we hope our show can help viewers start a conversation.
And if you ever feel you need someone to talk with, reach out to a parent, a friend, a school counselor, or an adult you trust. Call a local helpline or go to 13reasonswhy.info.
If the subject matter of 13 Reasons Why makes you feel triggered, I would suggest instead of going to be marketed to by Netflix, you check one of the other websites that will be linked in the description box under resources.
Because the minute you start talking about it, it gets easier.
So that's the PSA that they added. Does it feel weird to you too? Do you feel that same dissonance? Like you're being warned to maybe not watch the show, but it's also being elevator pitched to you? It deals with real, important, hard-hitting, real-world issues, and maybe you need your mommy to watch it for you if you're not mature enough. I think I'm still only on number 1, so I think we'll move on to number 2 now, which is very, very related to this. Reason number 2. The cast's shiny, new, and immensely unfair damage control job after season 1 came out. And Exhibit A for that is this video of Justin Prentice reading a letter from a fan. I have censored out some of the more triggering and extreme details in this letter, especially as I'm taking it out of the original context that it was written for. But I have an issue with this as promotional material for a show for teenagers. And I have an issue with this as something that an actor is expected to perform the emotional labor of reacting to on camera as part of their job. I mean, look at him having to respond to some of this.
Coming up on 8 months free of self-harm. Amazing.
He doesn't do a bad job, but I just can't help but feel a little bad. I think this feature exists for 2 reasons, and Netflix doesn't respect its teenage audience well enough to attempt to hide either of them very well. The first one is an attempted salvage job for whether or not anybody can take this boy they still want to use in their marketing at his word, even though they've been casting him as this irredeemable bad guy.
Sorry you're getting hate about your character. Thank you. You're not him, and I wish people would understand that. You portray a person I'm terrified of, but you're showing someone that needs to be put out there and talked about. Thanks again for saving my life. Much love to you and everyone involved with the show.
And I do wonder how much of that this guy knew he was getting into. So maybe less so than just cynically needing to preserve his worth as a marketing tool. They were trying to help him recover some of his reputation a little bit. But here's the second reason. There were an unfortunate rash of deaths that were linked to the release of 13 Reasons Why. A rise in teenage suicides that were labeled as copycat deaths. It's not something that I intend on getting into very far in this video, but it is important context for when I mention things like feeling like Netflix had to shift their approach after the release of the first season and the real-world repercussions of that. And it's impossible for me to completely ignore as I'm trying to just shake all of these thoughts out of my head for good.
Watching this show tests my strength as a survivor, and I think it has brought out the side of me that wants to further advocate for survivors of traumatic assaults. You have all inspired me to speak out about my story.
So this featurette came out a year after 13 Reasons Why. Far enough afterwards that the backlash had been recorded and reported on heavily. It's a letter from a fan, and I'm sure that this kind of media receives lots and lots of letters from emotionally vulnerable fans who feel a very heightened state of connection to it. It's also a justification for the existence of the show itself. I've been doing more research into the author since we last spoke about this like a second ago, and it's not just the show that seems to have this fixation on using letters from vulnerable youth as a marketing tool. Kind of seems to me like it's something that the author has been really stoked has been like a reward of his writing career for a long time before now.
We do a lot of workshops on suicide prevention, where I'm a keynote speaker a lot of times, which without a degree, especially a medical degree or anything, a lot of people show up going, why is this author talking? What I do is I share a lot of the emails I get from teens.
I mean, at the time of me analyzing this interview, it is 14 years old. This has been this guy's thing for a while, apparently. Check it out.
I share a lot of the emails I get from teens who sometimes come straight out and say the book saved their life. It made them see things in a totally different way because they were suicidal or had attempted suicide in the past. Those emails are amazing to share because there's this near tragedy that has become this really positive thing.
I feel weird about that, and I feel mean for feeling weird about it. Like, I don't think that anyone who wrote those letters is going to watch this video, but if they do, I'm not making fun of your letter. I don't think you did anything wrong by writing to the show that you care about or the author of a book that you really care about. I think they did something wrong monetizing themselves with it. I think they betrayed what you were entrusting them with.
It's not the show that's making them the heroes that they are, but if it helps just a little bit, that's such a beautiful thing.
And just, like, there's no way that these actors knew what they were getting into, right? So last time I was recording about this, I thought that Justin Prentice was the only one who was asked to do that kind of letter reading. He was in the thumbnail for one that said the cast of 13 Reasons Why reads a letter, and he was in one that said Bryce Prentice, actor boy, reads a letter. But this is something that they have involved a few members of the cast in.
So you can just read it?
What kind of culture is that encouraging in its fans to say, hey, look, since the show came out a year ago, letters have been pouring out from all over the world. Tell us all about the worst things that have ever happened to you. Maybe your favorite will read it in a commercial. And I wonder if you get to say no when Netflix says, hey, come do this.
I'm kind of terrified.
Some of the first credits that some of these actors even have, and they were like 3 years younger than they were at the time of promotion when they filmed it. Maybe they could have said, no, sorry, I don't want extra money to come read somebody's trauma letter. But once you've been in that show, you don't continue to have the option to consent or not before somebody just kind of runs up to you and tells you all of the worst things that have ever happened to them. The show has been encouraging that kind of relationship. It's not appropriate, of course, on the parts of the fan, but you manipulate your audience into thinking that this kind of parasocial thing is at all the way that they should be engaging with media. And you're signing these kids up to spend the rest of their lives in such a weird fucking position. Like, I think that's ultimately where the positioning of this as something bigger and more societally important and impactful than Riverdale or whatever matters.
It just actually feels like we're doing something important when we're making this, and it also just feels deeply affecting.
I'm sure the Riverdale kids got a lot of people running up to them and telling them intense things, but the very subject matter of 13 Reasons Why really constantly stokes this fan culture around it, around the show. Their insistence that they are attempting to bring things into the light and start a conversation. The tapes themselves, the act of having a cache of 13 different people who you want to directly blame in part for your own decision, is cruel. I haven't reread the book recently enough to know for certain whether or not this is true there as well, but in the show, Hannah's mother says that they weren't even left a note. In a way, that sort of reframes what Hannah has done to me. This isn't somebody explaining to everyone who might care why she's taken a drastic, rash decision. She sat down and made a list of her enemies. She wanted the harm that she caused to herself to be pain to them, and found a way to engineer that into happening that is just incredibly unrealistic in real life. It is a fucked up thing to do, to directly blame somebody like that for something that you have chosen to do to yourself. She, as a hallucination who is teamed up with Clay, she gets to become the main character after her death and stay that way for a very long time. I have video essays linked in the description that explain better than I can why this is just a horrifically bad decision in terms of what to convey in a television show about this kind of thing. And while bullying absolutely can lead to suicide in teens, it is a strange and interesting choice to contrive your own version of a victim of bullying who has this fiery ability to draw exact revenge from beyond the grave.
Maybe I'll never know why you did what you did.
I can make you understand how it felt.
I don't know what level of research Jay Asher did on portraying teen suicide. Oh, I can answer that. None. No research. He did none. Actually, in spite of the fact that this book is marketed as an anti-bullying anthem, apparently he didn't even know that that's what the message was about when he wrote the book. I would think I was exaggerating too, but no, listen.
When I was writing the book, I never actually saw it as an anti-bullying book. So when I first heard people using it in schools to talk about bullying, I realized that my definition of bullying was too narrow.
So, like, he didn't do any research. He didn't talk to anybody but this close relative.
Close relative of mine, when she was the same age as Hannah, a junior in high school, attempted suicide, survived 9 years before I started the book. And then one day this idea came to me, and I felt I understood somebody like Hannah, or how somebody could become like Hannah, enough by talking to my relative that I felt comfortable writing.
I'm pretty sure that I've been a teenager more recently at the time of recording this than Jay Asher had been at the time of writing 13 Reasons Why. Way more sure about the fact that I have much more recently been a teenage girl than he has, because he was never a teenage girl. And I can't imagine, as an adult woman, if I were to write a book for teenagers that purported to be about such important subject matter, being so fucking audacious that I would expect that I knew enough about what being a teenager in the modern day was like to know what I needed to portray.
I felt I understood somebody like Hannah, or how somebody could become like Hannah, enough by talking to my relative that I felt comfortable writing.
There are a ton of things that fall in line in retrospect with Jay Asher's thinking that I want to talk about, other than just the absolute lack of humility required to assume that by right of having spoken to one person who attempted suicide one time, you understand enough to create any kind of avatar for the teenage experience.
I was going to school to be an elementary school teacher, and then a lot of the girls I dated, their moms or dads were teachers, and I decided that sounds a lot harder than I thought.
Oh, right.
Maybe part of what he realized was difficult is that, like, if somebody hands you just something that they didn't research at all and just kind of vibed their way through while they were thinking, I am so great, you have to give them, like, a bad grade and tell them to try again harder. And that's not a thought that I think connects in his brain. And, like, school of the dining room table over here, right? Like, I was homeschooled. I'm not implying that his worth as a writer or an artist or pretty much almost anything other than the thing I'm about to say is impacted by his lack of having a degree. However, I don't think it's a hot take that there are some jobs that require degrees for good reason. Things like, I don't know, being a doctor or a therapist. The best intentions in the world don't matter when those people who have degrees for a good reason in the thing that you think you have good intentions about could have been a resource for you and they weren't.
Now, when I tell other parents about this book,
I know what you're going to say.
What am I going to say?
They're very hesitant about it.
Yeah. What do you tell them?
I totally understand that. And I had the same reaction when I came up with the idea. Is that really something I want to talk about? So I understand the hesitation, and I know my intention when writing it, which was obviously a good intention, but also hearing from teens and hearing how they're getting it.
This man didn't take a class. He didn't speak to a counselor. He didn't ask if he could talk to a teacher. Honestly, not being a teacher because he's anti-research and second drafts and asking for feedback kind of makes sense to me. I think I'll just go with it. I'm as qualified to assume that as he is to assume that he understands what was going on in his mentally ill relative's mind. Hannah popped into his mind fully formed, and he felt qualified to write her because he had already depersonalized and devalued the real human being who he is clearly fucking picking on with this book, who he knows who is mentally ill. And I don't know if that's the close relative or if that's somebody in school that he hated or if it's just a bias that he has. I can tell you this, though. If this man knew what it felt like to be suicidal, that would have been part of his branding. It isn't for a reason, and it isn't because he feels like he's above it. I talk about this all the time when I'm trying to rationalize why people are homophobic. People who really, really, really hate gay people or people who struggle with addiction. And it's always that thought of picking a target that you're very unlikely in your mind to potentially hit. It's why I roll my eyes at most of the homophobes are secretly gay things, because it's generally that's not done out of self-hatred, because even though they still hate themselves, it's for something different that I don't care about. There are a lot of things I really, really hate about the way that Jay Asher speaks about anything he seems to have ever been asked about. But wow, do I hate the way that he talks about this supposed close relative who attempted suicide in junior high.
She, and which Hannah does a lot in the book as well, she would drop hints and use the fact that nobody was picking up on these hints as confirmation that nobody cares.
I don't have another explanation. He just lacks empathy. He thinks that having known a mentally ill person and having had access, front row tickets, it feels like he thinks, to the circus, grants him any kind of knowledge or authority or ability to be helpful. He's marketing himself as if he understands all of this. He's saying in the same interview, oh, so many people tell me that they had tried to take their own life and they didn't because of 13 Reasons Why. As he says, most of the kids who read this book aren't suicidal.
You know, most of the teens aren't suicidal, but they read the book and they see how the small things can affect people differently than it might affect them. And that's what 85-90% of the people get out of the book.
What do you mean? 80% of the people who read your mental health book aren't mentally ill? You wrote a bad book, dude. And while 13 Reasons Why does pay absolute lip service to the concept that suicide is never the correct option, it would be naive to say that it doesn't present it as if it is one.
In all honesty, I did think suicide was an option.
But after watching the show, I realized how hard it is to do, how hard it is to watch.
By comparison to the book being vague and off-screen, there's an almost DIY element to the horror and the panic of Hannah Baker's final scene in the show.
In all honesty, I did think suicide was an option.
But after watching the show, I realized how hard it is to do, how hard it is to watch.
I haven't seen the re-edited version, but as far as I'm aware, they didn't go back in and change it to match what had happened in the book. The method was different. The visuals were different. There are still visuals that tie into that gory graphic version that I have seen in earlier episodes that I just recently rewatched. I've been doing some reading since we last spoke, and it's kind of a good news, bad news situation. Because I do get to tell you about a piece of young adult literature that I think fulfilled all of the expectations of starting a conversation around something usually kept quiet due to stigma and fear. But the bad news is that book is not 13 Reasons Why, which is another book that I've read since last recording. Turns out 13 Reasons Why is a lot worse than I remembered, and a lot worse than I was giving it credit for being when I was filming my analysis of the show. This is the point in the video where I have to explain that we're not gonna get to 13. It was a fun gimmick when I thought that this was a bad adaptation of something that was mostly fine, but it feels a little bit beating a dead horse to keep saying how manipulative and terrible the show is when it was always going to end up being that way, when it was based on a book that is this bad, this insensitive with its source material, and this unempathetic to its main character. Actually, just that analysis that I made right now of Hannah Baker being the main character, as I played before in that clip where Jay was explaining the plot of the book himself, he doesn't see Hannah as the main character. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about that.
So is this story his or is it hers?
In the end, I think it's his story. It's about things that happened to her, but everything she says is filtered through him. And he's the one that, at the end of the book, has a little change.
This boy's name is Clay Jensen.
Yes.
Which is modeled after you a little bit.
A little bit in high school. I was definitely a shy person. Clay's on his way to becoming valedictorian. In that way, we're nothing alike.
So we know that Clay is basically his self-insert, another thing that he openly admitted to. And hey, I don't even think that's bad. There's a third author at play here. Another young adult book that I haven't reread, and I'm going to tell you why when we talk about him a little bit more. But this really invites the comparison to me with the author of It's Kind of a Funny Story.
Kind of a Funny Story is about a teenage kid who gets really, really pressured by the work he has to do in high school. He goes to an ultra-competitive high school that's loosely based on Stuyvesant, where I went, but is called Executive Pre-Professional High School. And he gets so stressed out that he gets depressed. He gets clinically depressed. And the book traces his journey for 5 days in the psych hospital.
When I said earlier that I thought that if Jay Asher had experienced suicidal ideation or depression firsthand, it would be part of his branding, I was picturing something like a more cynical version of this honesty that Ned Vizzini had about It's Kind of a Funny Story.
I spent a very intense week in a psych hospital when I was in my early 20s. And when I got out of the hospital, I started writing about it, but I fictionalized my experiences and I gave them to a teenager as opposed to me.
Now, in terms of being the first to start a conversation, It's Kind of a Funny Story did come out about a year prior to 13 Reasons Why being published. I seriously doubt that Jay Asher ever read It's Kind of a Funny Story. I guess you could say it's kind of funny, to me, that a book that does a better job of starting the conversation even beat 13 Reasons to publication. But that's more just me being petty and having favoritism with my young adult authors. So I would like to talk about It's Kind of a Funny Story, even though I have not actually reread it recently. And I'm going to tell you why that is after I show you some of the key differences in the way that the author of that book, It's Kind of a Funny Story, reacted to some of the questions that he got versus the way that Jay Asher speaks about it.
I realized that my definition of bullying was too narrow.
I don't feel qualified to speak about cyberbullying specifically, or bullying. I feel qualified to speak from the point of view of help for people who are in mental distress, right? Because that's what It's Kind of a Funny Story is about. One thing that I think would be, maybe the news cycles would be slightly different if we really drummed into people's heads. Like, if you're feeling suicidal, you should call the suicide hotline, because when you call the suicide hotline, you're immediately on the phone with someone very calm and professional who knows what they're doing, and without even realizing it, if you're like me, you'll be quietly convinced that you have to leave and go to a hospital. The easy thing is, 1-800-SUICIDE that's a national hotline. So it's very easy to remember because it's 7 letters. This is something I talk about in the book.
The thing here that ties me back again to the lack of empathy and the lack of lived experience is the very difference between having your character, who is meant to be your sympathetic protagonist, have mental issues that you yourself struggled with, compared to having a character who you think the audience is supposed to grow frustrated with have mental issues that you yourself do not struggle with.
Right, and another important role that Clay plays is he at first starts out being just completely crushed and sad about what Hannah's telling him, but at some point he starts getting frustrated with her and upset at her and pointing out, wait a second, you could have gotten help right there, but you didn't.
I read It's Kind of a Funny Story when I was a teenager, and I immediately loved it. I remember poring over the pages and feeling so convinced that this man who was writing this book knew what he was talking about, because the brain of this character that he was writing worked so much like my brain.
I'm waiting for her to say, Craig, what you need to do is X, and for the shift to occur. I want there to be a shift so bad. I want to feel my brain slide back into the slot it was meant to be in, rest there the way it did before the fall of last year, back when I was young and witty, and my teacher said I had incredible promise. And I had incredible promise. And I spoke up in class because I was excited and smart about the world. I want the shift so bad. I'm waiting for the phrase that will invoke it. It'll be like a miracle within my life.
Just a handful of months after I read and really connected with It's Kind of a Funny Story, I learned that the author had died by suicide. In the intervening months, I had Googled and learned what I just showed you, that he had been very honest and upfront the whole time that it was at least partially inspired by a real hospitalization. That is something that irrevocably colors the book on reread. I was a teenager who would reread my favorite books over and over again, and I have never been able to get through It's Kind of a Funny Story thinking about the fact that that is what happened to this man who seems to share the same brain as me. And in that way, It's Kind of a Funny Story and 13 Reasons Why are split not just in quality or the right that the author had to write about that content, but also in terms of the message that it delivers. So maybe that's another angle by which it is unfair to compare Jay Asher and Ned Vizzini. This is actually another reason that I abandoned my mostly criticizing the show format. I thought I had a lot to say about how weird it was that Hannah Baker had what I was describing as cool girl syndrome while she was supposed to be this reverse-engineered bullying victim. The thing is, though, that despite the fact that Clay does have a crush on her in both the book and the show, she's really not portrayed aspirationally. And if you're taking some of the criticisms of what I'm saying should be portrayed to teenagers, maybe that's a good thing, right? You don't want people to think that this girl who took her own life is doing all of the cool girl things. I can understand that on some level, but I've read enough other books, and even other books for teenagers, that deal with characters with these kinds of mental health struggles that are a whole lot more empathetic to the main character. Like I said before, Ned Vizzini, in It's Kind of a Funny Story, really used his own experiences to inform his writing of Craig and his experience in a psych ward. As a result, in my opinion, the characters in It's Kind of a Funny Story are portrayed with a whole hell of a lot more fondness than you can find in 13 Reasons Why. 13 Reasons Why, the book, does not feel fond of Hannah. Clay's crush burns off pretty quickly. He realizes the shine is worn off of this manic pixie dream girl, and I do think that there was maybe some level of that was supposed to be written in and just wasn't very skilled. Because this book is bad. In addition to it being a bad premise and bad subject matter that I think should have been handled differently, it is poorly written to point of being nearly excruciating at times. like how she describes getting into this hot tub, which is a scene that we will be talking about in just a moment.
I took off my top, pulled off my shoes, took off my pants, and climbed the wooden steps. And then I descended into the water. It felt so relaxing, so comforting.
So if you, like me, haven't read the book in a long time, or maybe you had seen the first season of the show, or even just knew about it, and you know before I tell you what traumatic thing happens to Hannah in that bathtub, you might be in the same boat that I was in when I first started researching this video, which is to be so confused that Jay Asher somehow didn't understand that he was writing a book about bullying. The thing is, though, if we look at this book author and also show-approved phrasing,
it's about how every single person, whether what they did seems small or large, how all of it together kind of builds up in certain people and can lead them to do something like take their own life.
I start to realize that he didn't write a book about Hannah Baker being bullied. He wrote a book about a character he didn't like, and the end of that character's story happened to be that they killed themselves. And that had an effect on the male character, which is the takeaway point of the whole book, he says.
In the end, I think it's his story. It's about things that happened to her, but everything she says is filtered through him. And he's the one that, at the end of the book, has a little change.
So what do I mean? How can a book be not about bullying at its conception, be about how if you say something to somebody the wrong way, they might take it the wrong way and hurt themselves, and then turn into an anti-bullying PSA at some point during its marketing? I suppose you could say that for us to uncover that point, I would need to tell you the story of Hannah Baker's life.
More specifically, why my life ended.
Just like Hannah does, we'll start with tape number 1. This one was sent and addressed to a boy named Justin, who was her first kiss. In both the show and the book, Justin is Hannah's first kiss and first boyfriend as she lives in this new town. She says that things between them were wonderful until he started bragging.
A week went by and I heard nothing, but eventually, as they always will, the rumors reached me. And everyone knows you can't disprove a rumor. I know what you're thinking. As I was telling the story, I was thinking the same thing myself. A kiss, a rumor based on a kiss made you do this to yourself? No. A rumor based on a kiss ruined a memory that I hoped would be special. A rumor based on a kiss started a reputation that other people believed in and reacted to. And sometimes, a rumor based on a kiss has a snowball effect. A rumor based on a kiss is just the beginning. Turn the tape over for more. And Justin, honey, stick around. You're not going to believe where your name pops up next.
Now, a big divergence between the book and the show that really starts calling in to question the fact that Hannah obviously is a victim, and it's weird that the author wouldn't have seen that, is an addition that's made in the show that I had kind of conflated within the two storylines as being the same. In the show, it's not just rumors that they did more than kiss at the park. Justin distributes an upskirt photograph of Hannah Baker. To be clear, just right off the bat, that is image-based sexual assault, made even worse by the fact that Hannah Baker is a minor. She's a high schooler. This is terrible. Obviously, the reputational hit that happens to teenage girls when things that aren't true are spread around about them can be damaging and challenging for them to live through, but wow, it's a really different circumstance than having photographs taken of you and distributed without your consent. There's another plot point in the show that makes me think that they just truly do not understand how bad and how violating it is to have photographs of you sent around. It's bewildering to me, genuinely. But like I said, the book doesn't take that route, maybe just because it was before camera phones were real big. Tapes number 2 and 3 are addressed and subsequently sent and passed on to and by Alex and Jessica, who were two of Hannah's first friends when she moved to this new town. The three of them formed a friend group, and then eventually Jessica and Alex both peeled away and started dating. After their breakup, and in an attempt to get under Jessica's skin, Alex wrote down Hannah's name for the best ass in their freshman class. Again, this is another example of sexual harassment that Hannah Baker was facing. The book seems to somewhat understand that.
I'm sure you have no idea why you're on here, Alex. You probably think you did a good thing, right? You voted me best ass in the freshman class. How could anyone be angry at that? Listen.
Being on the list leads to subsequent sexual harassment at school, as well as an incident of physical sexual assault with Bryce Walker.
A cupped hand smacked my ass. And then he said it. Best ass in the freshman class, Wally. Standing right here in your store.
Jessica is jealous because she was voted worst ass in freshman class opposite Hannah. They have a fight. Jessica refuses to hear Hannah's side of the story. It ends with a physically impossible scratch punch thing.
So tell me, Jessica, which did you mean to do? Punch me or scratch me? Because it felt like a little bit of both. Like you couldn't really decide. That tiny scar you've all seen above my eyebrow, that's the shape of Jessica's fingernail, which I plucked out myself.
If you're punching, I don't think you can put your nails out to scratch somebody unless you're like really wicked double jointed. I remember that taking me out of it in the book when I read it as a teenager, and it sure did this time too. Like I said, even aside from all of my moral scruples here, it's not a good or well-written book. Tapes number 4 and 5 cover another image-based sexual assault that is canon to the book. Tape number 4 is for Tyler, a scrawny camera nerd on the yearbook committee who has been stalking Hannah. Again, image-based sexual assault of a minor. He's taking photos of her through her bedroom window.
So how long did you stand like that, Tyler? Must have been pretty uncomfortable. And if you were willing to go through all that trouble just to get a peek at me, I hope you at least got something out of it.
The way this is written about is voyeuristic on multiple counts, which is kind of nodded to with tape number 5, which goes for the girl who helped her to set a trap to catch her stalker in the act.
A peeping Tom, she said. You mean a real one? I think so, I told her. I always wondered what that would be like, she said. Having a peeping Tom is kind of, I don't know, sexy. The other girl, she wasn't looking at your face, Tyler. Oh my God, she screamed. He's cramming his dick in his pants.
She finds herself quickly discarded by this girl who didn't want to be her friend, and she finds herself on the receiving end of even more rumors being spread by this girl about her being promiscuous. Tapes number 6 and 7 go to Marcus, who gets her name on a $1 Valentine's school event, asks her out on a date that he shows up 30 minutes late to, and then again attempts to sexually harass her during. This time it takes place in public, under the table at a diner. It's framed as something that happened that wasn't a large deal. That's how everything on these tapes is supposed to be understood to us, and it's deeply concerning to me. Obviously, Marcus is not being portrayed as the good guy, but again, if we look at the vision behind this book being, sometimes things just don't come across how you want them to, huh, buddy? This is weird. Tape number 7 goes to Zach, who was there at the diner during that incident. Zach tries to sit down across from her and cheer her up, and apparently gets upset when she isn't ultra receptive to it. Hannah assumes and fills us in, and we don't have any other way to judge why this happened, that Zach is upset that he wasn't flirted with in response when he attempted to make Hannah feel better after her sexual assault at the diner. he begins to steal notes of validation that she got in a class that had little anonymous letter bags for everybody set up. Again, this is another one of those points that's meant to lead to it's a snowball effect. Everybody had a little hand in the decision that she made larger message, but it feels messy and strange. His motivations for doing that aren't clear. We can only go with what Hannah assumes, and we're kind of being told that she's not the most reliable of narrators. Clay is getting increasingly frustrated with her over the course of hearing this story. His response to hearing about her having a stalker is to be upset because she should have called the police the first night. And his response when she brings that stalker up again later is to say that it's time to leave him alone. The book has weird sympathies and loyalties that carry into the show and make the entire thing just bad and a little bit incoherent. Tape number 8 is one that I have always found to be unfair and more than a little bit unrealistic. Suddenly we learn that Hannah Baker actually has written poetry this whole time, and at one point one of her poems was published anonymously. The entire student body apparently read it and mocked it. If they didn't know it was coming from somebody they were bullying, I don't understand why anybody would have even glanced at it. It's another thing on this list that is also made more sexual in the show than it was in the book. In the show, her poem for some reason mentions that she's wearing lacy black panties just because she can. And her mom cries because she's so happy to have something from her dead daughter who didn't leave a suicide note other than this weird vindictive screed. So Hannah blames this guy who does a lost and found poetry magazine for the decision that she's chosen to make and what she has done to herself. Again, not fair. Even more not fair for him than for anybody else on this list other than maybe Jessica. Really, really not fair. Imagine making somebody live with that because they published a poem you didn't tell them they could publish when they were in high school and you were in high school. And again, this isn't written where that's a bug and not a feature. We're supposed to be understanding that Hannah is overreacting and blowing things out of proportion. We're supposed to be frustrated by that overreaction. What does that do, though? It doesn't tell us anything new about the character, other than that she's even meaner than we thought she was to people who did even less to her. It just makes another excuse for her to act out in a way that makes it seem like she's alone of her own design. For her to have a reason to be upset with everybody that we can't look through with an empathetic lens of this victim of sexual harassment and sexual assault over and over again. Something so that we can see her the way that the author seems to see her. And if I think tape number 8 is unrealistic and unfair, I think tape number 9 is a big, big letdown. Jay Asher knows that he built the suspense this whole time by having you wonder what Clay did. And then he just lets all the air right out of that balloon.
Clay, honey, your name does not belong on this list.
That's right. Your whole emotional hook for holding in there with this book and wondering what your protagonist could have done, what you're going to have to forgive your protagonist for in this long list of terrible things that have been done to this other character. He didn't do anything. He shouldn't be on the list. He's just there so that the book can be written. Lazy writing. I don't have a larger analysis for this one other than that it pisses me off. This is lazy. Either commit to your everybody made Hannah Baker kill herself shtick, Or make one of the characters who actually had a part in this your narrator. You lazy hack. Also, get a real job. Stop writing. I'm gonna re-up my trigger warning here. If you've been listening so far and the mentions of sexual harassment have not startled you off, we're about to talk about it in a bit more detail here, though I won't be getting graphic. Tape number 10 picks up after her tape to Clay. During that tape to Clay, we uncovered a lot of what I think is some of actually the most harmful messaging in this book. But I want to talk about that a bit later. So instead, we're going to talk about tape number 10, which gets addressed to somebody who had already received and for some reason passed on the tapes. Hannah has a second set of tapes as blackmail that somebody else has and has been told to distribute if the list does not get completed. Everyone leading up to Clay, and including Clay at the end of the book, has just listened to the tapes and passed them along. Which means that Justin and Jess have both heard this story that Hannah tells. And Hannah tells the story of Jess being very drunk at a party and unable to consent. And Justin standing outside of the bedroom door when he puts her in a bed at the party and willingly letting one of his friends in to sexually assault her. Hannah is hidden in the closet while this happens. She doesn't get caught, and she carries a lot of guilt about it. Guilt that doesn't stop her from recording a play-by-play of what had happened and sending it to Jessica to have to listen to, and also sending it to like 12 other people. Again, incoherency. This also feels weird to me. I'm not saying that that's not a way that some cases of sexual assault with jock rapists happen. I am saying for a sense of economy of storytelling, isn't it a little bit weird that it didn't just go down with the boyfriend being the one to sexually assault her? It makes what's actually portrayed as the one true instance of sexual assault or rape in the book a little bit detached. Like it's something that only happens when it comes from Bryce Walker, the same one who grabbed her ass earlier in the book. But, you know, I'm sure Jay Asher doesn't have any weird ideas about consent or anything, so let's keep going. Tape number 11 is for a cheerleader named Jenny who knocks down a stop sign on her way home from a party because she's driving drunk. Within one night, the knocked down stop sign leads to a car accident that Clay had already told us about earlier in the book. A senior from their high school had been hit in a collision and died. This was apparently a big secret, but Clay is going to send the tapes to Jenny, and who knows, maybe she'll take ownership over it this time, but not the first time. The book doesn't care, it's over before then. Tape number 12 is what is, to me, and to I think most people who read it, another very clear, cut and dry case of sexual assault. Hannah does not want to have sex with Bryce. While she is getting into a hot tub that he is in, Clay is listening to her tape where she's explaining it, and he is upset with her for doing so. A lot of the things that Hannah does in this book are framed not as, look at this terrible thing that happened to this person, but look at these warning signs that this person was putting off. So to me, this need to stop and clarify to the audience that Hannah didn't technically say no, that she knew what was happening, that she knew what she was getting into, somehow that turns into this feeling that I'm being told not of a sexual assault that she survived, but that she was having risky, promiscuous sex because she wanted to die, and we should have noticed that. And those are two very, very different things. Again, Bryce Walker is basically the cartoon character version of a rapist. He's an irredeemable character in the book who ends up, for some reason, getting a lot of screen time in the show, and especially apparently in later seasons. What he does to Jessica is rape. What he does to Hannah is also rape. She is not in her right mind. She is not meaningfully and enthusiastically consenting. I'm just not sure that the book understands that Hannah was raped. If the book understood that, I don't think that Jay Asher would have had such a hard time realizing that it was about the victim of bullying. In tape number 13, Hannah breaks from the format. She hides the cassette recorder in her jacket pocket and goes to talk to the guidance counselor. When she tells Mr. Porter that she's been assaulted, he tries to pressure her to give up the name of the person who did it. When she won't, he tells her that if she doesn't have a plan to do something about it, she needs to start thinking about moving on. Hannah says, okay, great, sure, I'll just get on with it. I'll get on with my life, and storms out and is very upset that the guidance counselor does not chase after her. More than anything, this last tape is where this book loses me. Because it is true. A lot of adults don't know what to do when a young person comes to them and tells them that they're dealing with something real and terrible. But wow, doesn't it feel kind of irresponsible to not have some kind of pressure valve in your book for young teenagers? I don't have a problem with writing about parents who don't understand or bad teachers, but I think you kind of have to accept that you're going to write within the bowling alley lane bumpers if you're writing for children. And part of that is having the steam escape valve of having at least one adult who cares. You need to let the teenagers reading your book start thinking through the people that they know and saying, okay, if I don't feel safe talking to my parents, who can I talk to? You don't give them a list where you cross off all of those possibilities. Doing that is irresponsible. Hannah Baker tried to get help. She was not supported by the guidance counselor, and she took her own life. The book ends with Clay realizing that he should be more friendly to people who he thinks might take their own life. He mails the tapes on to the girl who knocked down the stop sign, and he talks to a girl in the hallway who he thinks might also be depressed. And that's the end of the book. What the hell, man? The worst of it is over now. We're through the tapes. And I want to reverse engineer our way through them to try to figure out Jay Asher's thought process, if we can, and why it was so hard for him to come to the realization that Hannah was a victim of more than just misconstruing things. Shall we? I've used the terms that I would use to define each event in the previous section, and now I'm going to use the least severe terms that I can, because I think Jay Asher might have thought that he was just writing some book for teenagers. And if he was thinking that he wasn't writing a larger message, maybe he didn't connect how severe some of these things are or can be. So with that framework, tape number 1 becomes Hannah Baker had a boyfriend and he started to brag to his buddies with locker room talk, maybe. You know, people don't always take things the way that we mean them. And when he began to brag, it impacted her reputation. Tape number 2. Because of that new reputation, Hannah Baker's former friend lists her on the best of list. He says that she has the best ass. He says that her other former friend, who he had just broken up with, had the worst ass. The other former friend is angry at Hannah and refuses to hear her side of the story, again, because of Hannah's promiscuous reputation. I struggle to downplay Tyler the way that the author does in the narrative. Again, Clay says it's time to leave Tyler alone when Hannah mentions him later. Clay, the moral and upstanding one, is the only one to refuse to throw a rock into his window when everyone else comes there after they listen to Hannah's tapes. A weird allegiance that is overcorrected in the show when Clay takes a photo of the yearbook guy through his window, takes and distributes a naked photo of his classmate in high school, and it's portrayed as him making his own justice and not as him stooping to the same level of image-based sexual assault. But I'm talking about the book. So, keeping with that theme of talking things down, the fourth reason is that somebody was taking creepy photos of her. And the fifth reason is that the person who she asked for help to catch the person taking creepy photos of her wasn't truly her friend and was using her, and then also contributed to spreading more rumors about her promiscuity. Number 6, she has a bad date. The sexual harassment that she receives on this date is portrayed as being because of her promiscuous reputation. I also want to take a moment and note that multiple times throughout the book, Clay mentions that he would have gotten closer to Hannah were it not for this reputation that she had received. He thinks that she was making a big reputation for herself in a few short months, and that kept him away from her. Which to me begs the question of, would a character who is like Hannah Baker in every way other than that they do enjoy flirting and kissing not be worth the little amount of empathy that is mustered for Hannah Baker because she is a victim of misunderstanding? Misunderstandings she's often framed as putting herself in. For tape number 7, we have Zach, and again, it's a shitty thing. I don't really know how that one is supposed to be framed as like a mountain out of a molehill, because that's just a really mean thing to do to somebody, and we don't understand why he does it. Still, somebody steals her silly little notes from her silly little class. There is a scene where she had put a note in an anonymous drop bag and wanted to talk about suicide, and that was mocked. But her reason, because everything has to be an exact revenge, is Zach stealing notes of affirmation that she says that she would have been getting had he not been taking them out of her bag. Again, she sets a trap. He takes it. There's no resolution to this. There is no resolution to a lot of things in this book. So, in addition to her notes being stolen, so is a poem that she wrote, and it's published. And then somebody leaves her alone at a party after she begs them to, when she starts freaking out after they're making out. And then somebody else gets sexually assaulted. Somebody drives her home while they're drunk and knocks down a stop sign, which causes an accident. She has sex that is framed so strangely by the narrative of the book with a man who we know is written to be a rapist. And reason number 13 is that when she talks to a guidance counselor, he doesn't say the right things. He doesn't understand her coded language. Especially with the knowledge that Jay believes that that is far enough into the book that the reader should be frustrated with Hannah. You're supposed to read it and come away with a level of sort of sympathy for the guidance counselor, almost. Clay is frustrated with the guidance counselor for not following after Hannah, but he's also frustrated with Hannah for not understanding what the guidance counselor means. It's not written with any level of respect or sympathy for how hard it would be to be a teenage girl and walk into a room and start a conversation like that. I want to talk about the book I read that's good. And I want to talk about an author who I really like and who I think really respects their young readers. And she actually has a very particular phrasing that she uses when she talks about letters that she gets from her fans. Check out how distinct this is from what we've heard from Jay Asher.
People started to invite me to visit their schools. And in the past decade, I visited about 500,000 high school students. And I've talked to them. More importantly, I've listened to them. And they've had the courage and the integrity to talk to me.
Isn't that refreshing? They had the courage and the integrity to reach out to me.
And everything that they tell me, I would never take a child's story and turn it into a book. That would be exploitation. But my readers let me know, what's going on in their lives, where their pains are and where their joys are, and that has led to every single other contemporary novel that I've written.
I would never share their stories because that would be exploitation. And it's possible to be in conversation with the people who like your work without then exploiting the letters that you get from them. Lori is a really good example of that. So the book of hers that I read to contrast to 13 Reasons Why is Speak.
Speak was the book that I was never going to write. Although I had a fairly pleasant childhood, middle school was hard because we moved around a lot. And high school was difficult because my family was going through some very, very hard times. And we had moved to a community where I didn't know anybody. We moved just before 9th grade started. And I didn't feel connected at all. And I wound up in the ruts of a pretty profound depression through all of 9th grade. And it kind of lingered for a little while after that. But, as a young adult and then an adult, I didn't want to spend much time thinking about those years because they weren't much fun. So now we're to the point in my life where I had, my oldest child was in 6th grade. And I think in the back burner of my mind, the subconscious is where all the really good writing takes place. All this was accumulating, and I was beginning to reflect with some perspective on my own adolescent experiences. And then the December that Stephanie was in 6th grade, I woke up in the throes of a nightmare, a very vivid nightmare in which a girl was sobbing. It's like, oh God. Because I have recurring nightmares all the time, usually a sign that I'm not dealing with something. And so I write about them. I got up that night and turned on my computer and wrote what, after a lot of revision, became the opening pages of Speak.
If you're not already familiar with Speak, it's another book that was written for teenagers about a serious subject matter. The one I said earlier is actually good. Like Jay, Lori had previously written for younger children. She didn't really want to write about adolescence yet, but she had the idea for Speak and she started to write it.
Wasn't going to write the book, didn't want to think about adolescence. My oldest kid was only in 6th grade, but clearly I had some things that I needed to process for my own soul.
Unlike Jay, Lori writes with a tremendous amount of empathy for her main character. Speak is about a girl named Melinda. Melinda has recently ruined a party that was being thrown the summer before. She called the police and wouldn't tell anybody why or what had happened. Not only can she not find the words to tell anybody what happened that night when she was sexually assaulted, she can't find many words at all. She speaks enough to get by in class, but eventually stops talking pretty much altogether. The symbolism that's going on in this book is that she has an art project due that takes her all year. She immediately loves this art teacher who's introduced. He kind of makes up his own rules. He's constantly at war with the school board. He tells everybody that they are to draw one word out of a hat and then they will focus on that for the rest of the year. Melinda is excited about this assignment. She says she wonders if he can really do that because it seems like too much fun. And then she's immediately disappointed because she picks a tree. And she thinks trees are boring. She learned how to draw trees already. He won't let her redraw. He says she's picked her fate, she has to learn what she can about the trees and paint that, draw that, sculpt that, whatever. Melinda thinks that this project is dumb, but she also cares about this more than any of her other schoolwork. She does linoleum cuttings, she does drawings, she does paintings, and she tries over and over again to figure out what she's trying to see in this tree. There's a lot of pretty... This book is for kids, and especially for kids who are first learning how to uncover metaphor in books. I'm not saying that the symbolism here is particularly subtle. There's a lot about regrowth and going through periods of dormancy. Melinda discovers all of that as she's working on this art project. At one point, when she has gone almost entirely selectively mute, it's Christmas and she's opening presents from her parents. Her parents are not great. They're not very present, and they are very far from being empathetic to what she's going through. But they gave her, among other more expensive presents, a sketchbook and new pencils, and they told her that they noticed that she had been trying to draw. This moment, to me, captures everything that J. Asher might have thought that he was trying to portray with Hannah Baker, and it does it so elegantly and with so much grace for this teenager. We are inside of Melinda's head. We watch her open this present and think, oh my God, they noticed that I've been drawing. And she feels overwhelmed by that consideration. She didn't think that they paid that much attention to her. She starts to think about how she might tell them what had happened to her in the summer. But externally, she's just sitting there surrounded by her presents, staring at the sketchbook. And eventually, while she's still warring with herself in her mind about how to tell them about something so difficult, the moment passes. Her mother starts cleaning up wrapping paper. Her father checks his watch and stands up. And once she's alone in the room, Melinda thinks, I didn't even say thank you. Just that scene does such a good job of balancing both what I can see as an adult looking back at it, the outward perspective of, yeah, you wish the parents had waited around longer. She didn't even say thank you. And of course she didn't even say thank you. She has so much more going on inside of her. She can't find those words, but nobody who's not reading that narrative knows that. And Laurie manages to portray that so elegantly, while Jay can only seem to portray it like not asking for help is a vindictive and selfish act when it's not. Another crucial difference between Speak and 13 Reasons Why is that when Melinda finally works up the nerve to talk, she's not dismissed for it by an adult. There is a scene where she attempts to talk to another student about what happened to her and she isn't believed. Again, I'm fine with things like that being portrayed, I just need a pressure valve. In Speak, the pressure valve comes in the form of her art teacher. He tells her, even when she's in trouble with other teachers at school, that he can tell that she's a good kid, that he wants to know what she's dealing with. And eventually, in the very last words of the book, Melinda asks him if she can tell him all about it. There is so much in Speak that is portrayed miles more elegantly than it is in 13 Reasons Why. Even just the writing in the scenes about sexual assault are in two completely different playing fields. What Laurie writes says what it needs to, it doesn't leave room for it to mean something else, and it doesn't give people ideas of things to do. A big difference, though, is that Laurie knew that she was writing about sexual assault. And even though she knew what she was writing about, she found that it was misconstrued with her male audience.
I wrote Twisted because so many boys, when I visited their classroom to talk about Speak, told me they didn't understand why the main character in Speak was upset after having been raped. And I got that from boys all over America in every demographic, really, really awesome boys who I would let date my daughters. This proved to me that I didn't understand boys. And just parenthetically, the reason that they didn't understand why she was upset is that it wasn't a stranger in the bushes with a gun. It was a hot guy, a senior, that she was on a date with, they were making out, and, this is a critical point, boys and girls are surrounded by hypersexuality in the media.
I really like what she says here when she says...
And so if you have a young man seeing all this stuff, and he has no adults in his life who's there to teach him the rules of human dignity, to teach him, well, this is why we don't hurt women, because this is a big deal, and she will be, really traumatized for a long time. That's why we have the sexual assault rates that we have. When you tell boys what the rules are, they're fine. They do a pretty good job, most of them. Boys have every bit as rich emotional lives as girls. They got all those feelings, but the culture only tells them you're allowed to show anger or rage, preferably on a sports field. And too many boys are feeling like once they get past, 10, 11 years old, they're not allowed to show their feelings. They're not allowed to be tender or to cry or to, have pride in an appropriate way. And so all these emotions get buckled down so tightly. And I think this leads to a lot of middle-aged guys being very miserable, because they've lost touch with that emotional self. And it makes the teenage boys sometimes do profoundly stupid things, because they're just like this. So yeah, it was the writing process of Twisted was incredible, getting into the head of a boy. Again, something I approached with a lot of respect, a lot of research and prayer to make sure that please help me do this right. And it worked. It worked. I get such great emails. Most of the email from boys is sent between 2 and 4 in the morning, and because they write to me as soon as they finish the book. And they write to me and they usually start out saying, dude, I love this book. And then they go on and tell me how it connects to their story. And it's hitting one of those notes every single time. Many of them have contemplated suicide. And that's just heartbreaking. But the good news is, they've got teachers that are handing them books, they've got librarians that are handing them books, and hopefully we can all be a village, and get them through adolescence and get them through safely.
But it does make me feel a little bit concerned about what rules are being portrayed to them in, for example, 13 Reasons Why. Rules like that the only real sexual assault happens if you're the one-dimensional sexual assaulter character. Rules like, and this is what I alluded to earlier as thinking might be the most damaging, if you think a girl has bad mental health, you shouldn't leave her alone when she tells you to. Clay's whole tape, the reason that she freaked out at the party, is because they started to make out. Their somewhat unrequited thing became requited for a minute. And then she remembered her first kiss with Justin. She remembered how that played out. And she started to panic. She told him multiple times to leave, and eventually he did. And though he gets the lip service of, you don't belong on these tapes, what's the message? That he shouldn't have left? That if he would not have left, what happened to Jessica wouldn't have happened? What Hannah did later wouldn't have happened? What is the point of having I was left alone when I asked to be left alone as one of the reasons that somebody committed suicide, if not to strip some of the autonomy away from suicidal people in whether or not they want to be left alone when they say they want to be left alone? Clay should have left. Clay did the right thing. She sent him away. He said, "Are you okay?" and tried to make sure, and she said, "Leave." In the show, I think she says, "Fuck you, leave," or "Get the fuck out," or something like that. He did the right thing to leave. And the narrative explicitly says that he did not.
I'm not going. Not now. Not ever.
Why didn't you say this to me when I was alive?
What message is that sending to boys who are watching? Well-meaning boys. Boys who see themselves in Clay and not in Bryce. What invitations is that giving them? What invitations does that author think that he has, that he might not? So here's the thing that, for me, split this video into multiple timelines. It wasn't just that I realized I needed to put myself through rereading the book so that I would have that context. It was some research that I was doing to back up a point that I had made in my analysis of the show. See, I used the word confused to describe the show's relationship with consent. And the fact that I can't use that word anymore is why I needed to go in and edit this video the way that I did. See, 13 Reasons Why, the show, was always going to have an incoherent understanding of consent, just like it was always going to have an incoherent understanding of Hannah's mental illness or the things that suicidal people live through. The author of the book that it was based on doesn't have a coherent understanding of either of those things. How could he have put it in his book? So, here's what split that timeline up. Did you know that Jay Asher was only a producer for 13 Reasons Why during the first season? I didn't. They used him pretty heavily in marketing for season 1. It was a selling point for the show that the author of the book was on board with it. And he apparently was able to visit the set for season 2, although I didn't find anything one way or the other about seasons 3 or 4. It seems to be that the reason he was removed from the show was actually because his removal from something else was made public. As you may have noticed from this whole everybody has their own side of the story Hannah Baker is telling narrative, Jay Asher is very into the idea that there are 13 sides to every story or some bullshit like that. So it won't surprise you, I bet, to hear that he kind of has some contentions with the way that this was reported on. I'm gonna tell you the gist of what I understand and why I think we can draw some conclusions from that, but I am gonna let you hear a little bit of what he thinks counts as a defense for himself. So Jay was removed, and he disputes whether or not this happened against his will or because he agreed to do it, but not whether or not it happened as a result of a complaint. So sometime around April of 2017, Jay Asher was involved in something of a scandal that was kept pretty quiet within the confines of this Society of Children's Book Authors and Illustrators. When I say it was kept quiet, I mean that this isn't something that would come to light until after the first season of 13 Reasons Why had already been released. There's an excellent article in Vulture that details why Jay Asher was able to kind of get away with sneaking this silence deal in under the table just before the Me Too movement that I highly recommend and will be pulling quotes from in this section. So some of Jay's complaints here are that he says he was not involuntarily removed, but that he decided himself to stop attending events. Even Jay isn't disputing whether or not a letter was sent to this society and actions were proposed regarding that. No matter how much we let Jay Asher try to tell us that he made some big chivalrous gesture of deciding that he would leave, he hasn't disputed the fact that this email was sent. The email was signed by 7 women anonymously who all told the same story, that Jay Asher used this Society of Children's Books Authors and Illustrators as a meeting ground. He would use conferences to meet and lure members into affairs, and once those affairs had progressed, it says that he would threaten them into silence about them. The 7 women said that he made them feel unsafe at society events. Jay does not dispute this email exists. He does attempt to recontextualize it later, but I'm not going to let him do that yet. We're going to keep talking about this. Because really, that's what changed this video, but also didn't really change this video. right? Like, I'm doing this research about this book that just has a gaping hole where its understanding of consent should be, and then I see a headline that makes me think, oh, wait, Jay Asher is a sex pest. And then I went, oh my god, of course. And now I have this big band-aid on my forehead so that you can tell when it's the present day. It's really not funny, other than the way that it's always a little bit funny when somebody that you were suspicious of stops making you work so hard to maintain that suspicion, you know? Like, the way that this man talks about entry-level subjects that he clearly does not understand. Thinking about the way that we've just been seeing him do that about mental health issues. Of course he was doing that with feminism. He understands enough about mental health to know that somebody who's suicidal would have a hard time reaching out. He understands enough about coercion and sexual assault to write a one-dimensional cartoon character of a rapist that he knows he is not. I want to make it clear, just in case he gets Sue happy, I'm not making allegations here. I don't think that he's a Bryce Walker-style supervillain. I think the fact that he isn't is why he hasn't thought to try to rationalize why these women might actually have been uncomfortable with him. I'm not a man, so obviously that's not really an experience that I can speak to. But it's always felt very bare minimum to me for a man to be very against the one-dimensional, no nuance, men should not attack and sexually assault women. Right, like, that's just a standard, though. It's not something that I think anybody should get accolades for or be portrayed as some kind of a hero or activist. And even in comments about this whole deal, I was seeing people say, oh wow, Jay Asher became the very thing he was writing against. And it's like, he kind of didn't. Because Clay would have done something to inadvertently make Hannah feel uncomfortable if he did. There could have been something in their relationship with this teenage boy who had a crush on her. Not that everybody in your story has to do something unforgivable, but even the show did a better job at showing ways that Clay misstepped with Hannah. The book, because Clay is Jay, and like, if you haven't taken a second to just realize how lazy that is, Jay Asher, Clay Jensen. Jay, Clay. He said in the end of the version of 13 Reasons Why that I got from my library that he wanted to name Hannah Anna Baker, which is the most like, what's women named? Okay, Anna. But he said that he read that there were already books with people named Anna who were depressed. So he changed it to Hannah. He just added a letter. He just added one letter. Doesn't that just, like... I'm trying not to get mad about the stupid stuff now that I'm talking about the stuff that's more serious, but again, lazy hack. Lazy hack. So let's see what this lazy hack has to say about this letter that was written, right? Because he did try to defend himself. He actually put in a lawsuit against the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators because he felt like he was being publicly embarrassed, and he was so mad that he no longer got to be on the set for 13 Reasons Why. He said, I did have affairs with consenting adults that ended years ago. And, like, okay, nobody said they weren't consenting adults, buddy. The fact that they were adults wasn't in question here. We're gonna leave that alone. These are adults. These are women who were in a society of children's book writers and illustrators. So he's coming in here and being like, whoa, buddy! You think I was doing something way worse than you heard that I did? That's ridiculous. No, you're not getting away with that, Jay. You don't get a fucking inch from me. So Jay says, okay, yeah, I did have affairs with consenting adults that ended years ago. I am ashamed of myself and the pain our actions cause our families. Look, I don't have anything to say here about like an extramarital affair. It's not my business. It sucks. Don't cheat on your wife. But like, okay, whatever. If you're gonna cheat on your wife, don't do it at work. Don't do it at work when you are an established author who has connections not just in the literary world, but also now in Netflix and with TV, and you have school speaking things, and people take you seriously. Do you not understand that taking advantage of and exploiting things that make you seem like more of a catch is exploitative? Of course you don't. You don't think it's exploitative to go read letters from teenagers about the worst things that ever happened to them. You don't know what exploitation is. You know that you would never force yourself on somebody, and you are so fucking proud of yourself for that you've never stopped to think again about how you interact with a woman. That's what it tells me. And I know that that's like a rough way of putting it. I know that some people think that men who take those baby steps need to be more admired for those baby steps, but I don't. I think if you're going to put yourself in a position where you're pretending like anything you say has any fucking value, you better make sure that it's backed up in your actions, in your understanding of your actions, in your understanding of the context that your actions are surrounded by. This is like a whole thing within the publishing world, right? Like, the reason that this came out years after Jay Asher was removed from the society was because an article was published about another guy doing the same thing. And in the comments of that article, people were like, oh wow, I thought this was going to be about Jay Asher because he does that too. Jay wants to recontextualize this. He wants to say that he had affairs that were on totally even ground, and that he's embarrassed by those now because what he shouldn't have done is cheat on his wife. And I agree he shouldn't have cheated on his wife. But also, he shouldn't have been sleeping with people who were underneath his level of connection, authority, and general recognition in his industry. There are fucking YouTubers who have much less of a platform based on billing themselves as somebody respectable and understandable, who know that it's wrong to date somebody who likes them because of their platform. People who make YouTube videos. People who are not going into classrooms and bragging about how they save lives and understand sexual assault and bullying. Jay claims that he was harassed by these women that he had affairs with after they broke up. The women say that they had affairs with him and that they were intimidated by him into silence about them and then made to feel unsafe at convention industry, workplace events. Which one of those sounds more true? Just like weighing everything here. Do you think 7 women individually all had affairs with Jay Asher within this very specific workplace organization, but they're wrong that he was using it as a meeting ground for women to have affairs with? I don't know that this guy was doing his little slimy, yeah, I don't know, I could probably get you a meeting with Netflix. I don't know. I don't know if that's just subtext. I do know, by the time I got my first job, I knew better than to shit where I eat. Even outside of the broader understanding of how his power and position and influence would have affected the consent that he was getting from people, very basic entry-level stuff, dude. If it was as simple as that, or as a much sweeter way, an older gay man once told me to say that phrase, getting his bread where he buys his honey, he wouldn't have to come out and say things like, it's very scary when you know people are just not going to believe you once you open your mouth. I feel very conflicted about it, just because of what's going on in the culture and who's supposed to be believed and who's not. Go fuck yourself. Go absolutely fuck yourself. And then do it again. I hate this man. Okay, I calmed down. I don't think that Jay Asher respects his teenage audience. Listening to the way that he talked about transitioning from going to writing to younger children to writing for teens, as he had this idea for 13 Reasons Why, it kind of just feels like somebody who doesn't feel confident enough to just write a book for adults. And I don't say that to mean that I think that young adult literature is meant to be a training ground for people who just can't write good books for adults yet. I kind of mean it in the opposite way. I'm sure lots, maybe even most, I don't quite know enough about the industry to say for sure, I'm just kind of guessing. Most young adult authors stay pretty firmly in their young adult realm, but they would probably be able to make a passable book for adults. And if they didn't, they're not writing great young adult literature, they're just writing slop to go out into middle grade libraries. And I mean, that's fine, but let's not confuse ourselves and give people who write things like 13 Reasons Why the same kind of credit that we give to people who write things like Speak. I'm really fascinated by the way that young adult authors talk about their audience in general. I mean, this video could have been even longer somehow because I was going to go off on this whole thing about how even just the way that Jay Asher says teens skeeves me out. I find a lot more respect in people who say things like young readers or even like teenaged boys is so different than just teens. Teens is so lumping everybody into this one blob that I immediately understand that you don't know what it is. I have a lot of opinions about young adult literature. I'm planning on talking about The Hunger Games. Kit and I would love to make a video about Holes. If you have any other books that are for teenage readers that you think are a great example, or even another really bad example, I've been complaining a lot about Jay Asher, but the video itself has been really rewarding to work on just because of how much was there after I started scratching the surface of all of these consent issues that I noticed in the show and the book. I'd love to make more videos like this, more videos about books in general. If you have any that you would like me to cover, or if there's anything that you're surprised I didn't bring up about 13 Reasons Why, I would love to hear about it in the comment section below. Also, any of my rhetorical questions I genuinely do want answers to. Like, maybe don't be mean, but if you think I'm overthinking the content warning a little bit, I don't mind being told that. Okay, that was it. That's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you will subscribe and maybe come back for a video that I don't have to edit in multiple timelines because my script stays where I thought it would as I continue researching, but maybe they'll just all be like this. I'm not sure. Let me know what you think. Let me know what books I should read and talk about. Let me know if you want me to talk about the ways that my understanding of mental health also impacts my hatred of the book, because we really didn't even get into that on the personal level that we could have. I was going to talk about how Jay Asher is interested in starting parental discussions that begin and end at telling teenagers that it's safe and okay to talk to your parents, without equipping the parents for anything, because it just assumes that by right of like having a teen, which is a very like ownership way of putting it, which is why I was going to talk about that earlier and then didn't, and everything that came along with that, and it was just a little bit too much baggage while I was trying to keep this thing somewhere under 3 hours. Which I think I succeeded at, but if you don't care about that on the next one, let me know, and if you think I should cap them a little bit shorter, you can also let me know about that. I am Ophi, and I don't have 13 people that I would blame if I killed myself. Can I say that? Now I don't know how else to end the video.